You're about to meet someone who wakes up every morning to a wild bobcat chatting away like they've been best friends for years. Not just soft purrs or quiet huffs, but full-blown conversations filled with chirps, trills, and the kind of sass only nature could design. Now, here's the twist. This bobcat wasn't raised in a house. She wasn't trained, tamed, or meant to be anyone's pet. In fact, when she first arrived, she didn't make a sound. Not a single one. So what happened? What turned a silent, broken animal into a little chatterbox, who now refuses to let her human eat breakfast in peace without commentary? This story isn't just about a cute animal video. It's about what happens when two living beings, one grieving, one abandoned, quietly save each other. And somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, under the shadow of old oak trees and the hush of morning mist, something rare, something almost magical began to unfold. She was wild. He was wounded. Neither of them knew what they needed until they found each other. And now, she won't stop talking. Let's begin. The place where Juniper came from wasn't listed on any map. Not really. It was a clearing just off a back road that peeled away from the main highway like a forgotten thought. You'd miss it if you blinked a rusted trailer sitting behind a half-toppled woodpile, an old satellite dish leaning into weeds, and behind it all, a chain-link enclosure that used to house a dog, or maybe was never meant to house anything at all. That's where she lived, or rather existed. Juniper, a young female bobcat, had been kept inside that wire pen since she was barely old enough to open her eyes. No rocks to climb, no trees to scratch, no scent of the wild on the wind. Just mud that baked in summer and froze solid in winter. Just silence. She wasn't there for companionship. She wasn't even there for show. She was there for one reason: they thought she could have babies. No one remembers exactly who got it into their head that bobcats were worth money. Sell the kittens, maybe. Keep one breed again. A cute animal video waiting to go viral. That's what she was supposed to be. Cute, profitable, silent. But bobcats don't always play along with plans. As Juniper grew, her keepers noticed things that didn't fit. She wasn't gaining weight like she should. She didn't cycle. There were no signs of mating. Eventually, they took her still inside a cage to a local vet who told them flatly, she's sterile, likely from birth. The vet gave them a list of wildlife centers who might take her in. They never made the calls. Instead, they made a different kind of appointment, one that wasn't meant to heal. We don't know how long she had left, but it couldn't have been more than a few days. It's hard to say how much an animal understands about being unwanted, but if you had looked into Juniper's eyes in those final weeks, you might have felt something too close to knowing. Her coat had dulled to a dusty brown, her fur thinned from stress licking, the tips of her claws curled back toward her pads. She didn't growl or hiss anymore. She didn't react when birds landed near her cage. She just stopped. Stopped trying. Stopped expecting. Stopped hoping. What was once a wild cat baby had turned into a ghost behind steel and silence. But someone else had been listening. A neighbor, Raymond, a retired wildlife biologist, had passed that house countless times. For a long while, he hadn't said anything. People in towns like Woodvine tend to keep their thoughts to themselves, unless they're asked. But it was the sound that got to him. Every few nights when the air was still and the moon sat full, he'd hear it. Not a growl, not a howl, just a low, restless cry. It wasn't the sound of danger. It was the sound of not belonging. Raymond didn't knock on the door. He didn't argue. He made a call to Highland Pines Wildlife Refuge, a quiet center tucked between forested ridgelines where people and animals alike went when they had nowhere else to go. 20 hours later, a team arrived. It wasn't a dramatic rescue. There were no sirens or news crews, just a worn latch lifted open, a thick towel draped over her back, and two firm but gentle arms guiding her into a transport crate. She didn't resist. She didn't fight. She just sat there unmoving as the cage door closed. And that's the part that stayed with Raymond. He said later, I expected her to thrash, to scream, to rage, but she didn't. She just accepted. like she already knew the world didn't want her. And maybe that's what made her story different. Juniper wasn't rescued because someone thought she was adorable. She wasn't pulled out of a burning building. She was saved because someone finally listened, not to what she said, but to what she stopped saying. That's something we often forget, isn't it? In a world full of noise, the quiet ones often go unnoticed. The team at Highland Pines had seen a lot: injured owls, abandoned fox kits, even the occasional cougar cub. But Juniper was different, not in appearance, in absence. She had a wild animal's strength, but not its spark. She didn't bite. She didn't cower. She barely blinked. It was like something essential had been put on pause. They began her intake, hydrating her, trimming her nails, brushing out her fur in slow, deliberate strokes. They offered her a mix of lean venison and vitamins, which she refused for 2 days. She wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't react to touch. When they laid down straw, she moved to the cold corner instead. It's not that she was broken. It's that she had forgotten she could be anything else. That's something people sometimes don't understand about wild animal rescue, especially when they expect a redemption arc in a 2-minute video. Healing doesn't always come with dramatic recoveries. Sometimes it starts with one blink, one breath, one paw lifted off cold concrete. And in Juniper's case, it began with something else entirely: a photograph. A staff member taking inventory of the animals that week snapped a quick picture of her curled on a flannel blanket. Her eyes caught the light just enough to seem golden. That photo, posted online with no caption, quietly made its way through the town's Facebook groups. No filters, no hashtags. Just a look. And a woman named Martha Jean 2 towns over saw it. But that part of the story, their story, comes later. For now, it's worth pausing to understand something essential. Juniper wasn't saved because she was lovable. She was saved because someone believed she still had something left to give. That belief, that quiet insistence that a life still has value, even when it's inconvenient, is what changes everything. And here's the lesson, one that stretches far beyond wildlife rescue. Just because someone is silent doesn't mean they're okay. Just because they've stopped fighting doesn't mean they're ready to go. And just because the world has forgotten them doesn't mean their story is over. You might not see many videos like this, because this one doesn't begin with playfulness or joy or happy animal companionship. It begins where many things end, with abandonment, with silence. But as you'll soon see, silence isn't where this story stays. Because something was already in motion, quiet, steady, mysterious. A woman who hadn't smiled in weeks, a bobcat who hadn't made a sound in months, and a meeting neither of them was looking for, but both of them needed. Martha Jean used to fill her house with sound. Not the kind that blares or interrupts, just the small familiar notes of a life being lived. The scrape of her rocking chair across the old oak floors. The soft murmur of classical music while she sliced apples in the kitchen. The laugh of her husband echoing from the hallway when he forgot where he put his reading glasses. And always, always the weight of Smokey, her Maine Coon, thudding gently onto the end of her bed every night. Now the house didn't make a sound unless she did. It's strange, the things you notice after loss. How silence isn't just quiet, it's absence. It's the cup still sitting in the sink. The creak of a step you used to avoid because it made him laugh. The indentation on the cushion where Smokey liked to curl up, still faintly pressed into the fabric, even months after he was gone. Grief has a smell. Not the sharp kind, but the dusty scent of unused things. Wool blankets folded and never touched old recipe books, unopened lavender oil bottles on the counter still half full. A subtle blend of everything that was supposed to last longer. After her husband passed lung cancer, quick and cruel, Martha went through the motions. She wrote the thank you cards. She made the casseroles people dropped off stretch for days. She let her niece organize the closet. She said I'm fine more times than she could count. Then came her brother's stroke. Gone within hours. Then just 4 months later, Smokey. One morning he stopped eating. 3 days later he was gone. 18 years of companionship ended in silence. The vet said it was peaceful. She wasn't sure if he meant for him or for her. Now the mornings were the worst. She'd rise without an alarm, sit at the edge of the bed and stare at nothing. The windows offered no view, just the fog rolling in from the Blue Ridge foothills. Sometimes she made tea. Sometimes she didn't. The quiet didn't invite reflection. It pressed, it hung, it waited for her to acknowledge it. Some people grieve in motion. Martha grieved in stillness. She tried filling her time. She organized the pantry, alphabetized the herbs, sat on the porch with a book she never opened. Even the birds seemed to fly more softly around her yard, as if they understood. Friends checked in for a while, but life has a way of moving on without permission. The calls slowed. The church group met without her. The mail carrier began to linger less. People think that healing comes naturally, that time does the work. But Martha had a secret time had stopped. Not on the clock, but in her. She didn't feel old. She just felt invisible. Then one morning in late February, as frost clung to the window panes and the air carried that stillness only mountain towns know, Martha's phone buzzed. A message. No text, no subject. Just a photo. A bobcat lying on a flannel blanket staring directly into the camera. Amber eyes half closed, neither wild nor tame. Just there. It was sent by Ruthie, an old friend who volunteered part-time at a local wildlife rescue. Martha hadn't spoken to her in months. No caption, no explanation, just the photo. She stared at it for a long time. Not because it was strange, but because something about that gaze didn't let go. She wasn't looking for a wild animal. She wasn't looking for anything. But the moment she saw those eyes, something in her body leaned forward, not out of excitement, out of recognition. She didn't know the animal's name, didn't care. She felt the same thing she had felt when Smokey first crawled into her lap at the shelter 18 years ago, that quiet, inexplicable pull. Martha didn't analyze it. She didn't sit down to weigh the risks or make a list of reasons. She just stood, put on her boots, grabbed her old green coat, the one with the worn cuffs, and walked out the door. She didn't even tell Ruthie she was coming. That was the thing about grief. It didn't always make you cautious. Sometimes it made you brave. The drive took less than an hour. The landscape didn't change much. Bare trees, fields gone golden brown, the occasional hawk gliding over the ridgeline. But something in her did. She didn't know it yet, but she was driving towards something that had been waiting. When she arrived at Highland Pines Wildlife Refuge, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not empty, but purposeful, a place where everything moved slowly, respectfully. Volunteers nodded. A rescue worker named Raymond met her at the gate. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't need to. "I think I know who you're here for," he said gently. He led her to a large enclosure in the back, past rows of kennels and flight cages. The bobcat was lying in the corner, her coat a dull gold, her body coiled like she expected disappointment. Martha didn't approach right away. She just stood and waited. The bobcat rose, walked no-padded toward her with the hesitant grace of something learning to move again. She didn't hiss, didn't crouch. She just sat near the edge of the enclosure and looked. Martha knelt, not out of instinct, but because it felt like the right thing to do. She didn't reach through the wire. She simply looked back. And then after a long moment, the bobcat leaned her head forward just enough to rest it against the fence, right at the level of Martha's hand. No sound, no movement, just that. Later, Martha wouldn't remember what made her speak. Maybe it was the silence, maybe it was habit, but she said softly, "You look like someone who's been waiting a long time." Raymond didn't speak. No one did. Then, still on her knees, she turned to him and said, "If you'll let me, I'll take her home." It wasn't impulse. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. You see, people think companionship begins with similarity, shared hobbies, shared lives. But sometimes it begins with shared hurt. With two living things carrying a weight no one else sees. With two survivors looking at each other and thinking, "You too." And so began a new chapter neither of them expected. Martha hadn't prepared for a wildcat baby. She hadn't researched rescue animals or asked if bobcats made good companions. She hadn't considered the logistics. She just knew. The way you know you've left the porch light on for someone long before they arrive. And when she placed the travel crate near her fireplace later that afternoon and opened the door, she didn't call or coax. She just sat and waited. Juniper emerged not as a pet, not as a curiosity, but as a presence. She didn't explore. She didn't hide. She simply stood in the center of the room breathing. And that's when Martha noticed it. For the first time in months, the air in the house felt different. Not louder, not busier, just full. You could call it coincidence. You could call it instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more. A quiet force that lives in all of us, waiting for a place to land. A heartbeat, a reason to move again. And Martha, still sitting cross-legged on the rug, looked at the animal now sniffing the fireplace hearth and whispered, "Well then, I guess we'll figure it out together." Healing doesn't always come through people. Sometimes it arrives with pause in silence, without instructions. We don't always choose what saves us, but we can choose whether we're open when it comes. She wasn't planning to adopt a bobcat, but when Juniper pressed her head to that fence, Martha's life shifted on a hinge. What happened in the days that followed their first awkward conversations, their unspoken rules, would reveal something even more surprising. The wild animal didn't just want safety. She wanted connection, and she was ready to speak. The first night, Juniper didn't sleep. She didn't pace either, just stood in one corner of the living room, head low, legs, stiff ears, swiveling at every creak of the house. Martha Jean didn't try to approach. She'd laid a folded quilt on the rug by the fireplace, placed a shallow bowl of water nearby, and left the crate open. She dimmed the lights, turned off the radio, and said softly as she went upstairs, "I'll be here if you need me." Juniper didn't move. The house had never held something so still. Morning came slowly. Martha rose before the sun made tea and walked barefoot to the staircase. From halfway down, she saw Juniper still in the same corner, eyes wide but not frightened, alert but not wild. She wasn't hiding, she wasn't frozen, she was waiting. That was the moment something shifted. In animal rescue, there's a term people sometimes use, contact threshold. It's the point where fear stops leading the behavior, where survival instinct gives space for curiosity. For a bobcat, that line is razor thin. Wildcat babies like Juniper aren't wired to bond easily, especially after trauma. Yet here she was, eyes steady, unmoving, watching Martha watch her. Without breaking eye contact, Martha sat at the foot of the stairs and said, "Well, I'm glad you stayed." She didn't coo, didn't clap or reach out. She simply unwrapped a biscuit, placed it on the floor beside her, and sipped her tea. Juniper blinked. Slowly. Once. And then nothing. That was enough. Over the next 3 days, they repeated this dance. Martha moved gently, narrating her mornings aloud when she opened the curtains, fed the bluebirds, watered her herbs. She didn't expect Juniper to respond. It wasn't about commands, it was about presence. By the 4th day, the first contact happened. Martha had just settled into her armchair with a book, one she'd read countless times but never seemed to finish. Juniper, who had been resting near the back door, stood. No sudden movement, just a deliberate turn, a silent approach, and then she sat. Not at Martha's feet, not on her lap, just within reach. Close enough to hear her heartbeat, close enough to choose not to run. Martha didn't speak. She simply laid her hand palm down on the edge of the rug between them. Juniper looked at it, then at Martha. Then after a stillness so long it almost broke itself, she leaned forward and touched her nose, not to Martha's hand, but to the floor beside it, and exhaled. In the wild, that would have been the equivalent of a handshake. It wasn't affection. It wasn't fear. It was trust in its earliest form. There's something sacred about a creature choosing you when it doesn't have to, especially one that's known abandonment. Martha knew this feeling. It mirrored the moment Smokey all those years ago had curled beside her on a grief-heavy afternoon and simply stayed. But this was different. Juniper wasn't offering comfort. She was offering presence. Later that week, Raymond from Highland Pines checked in. When Martha told him what happened, he paused and said, "That's big. For her, that's a beginning. Most people don't wait long enough to see it." She nodded. She was beginning to understand. That same day, Martha noticed something else. Juniper made her first sound. It wasn't a growl or hiss. It was a soft, low chuff, a kind of throaty exhale unique to wildcats. Not aggressive, not playful, just a sound to say, "I'm here." That night, as wind moved through the trees outside, Martha sat on the floor, reading out loud from her book. She didn't look at Juniper, just read slowly, rhythmically, and as she turned a page, she heard it again, the soft chuff, a punctuation mark to the silence. Juniper had begun speaking, and Martha, who had once thought she'd never hear another living soul move through her home, felt the smallest ache of gratitude. Not for the sound itself, but for the choice behind it. In animal behavior, we often assign too much human meaning to animal actions. We say, "She loves me," or "He's trying to be funny." But there's another layer, deeper and more honest. It's not affection, it's attention. When an animal chooses to stay in the same room to make eye contact, to vocalize without fear, that's not entertainment. That's relationship. Martha wasn't expecting a cute animal video. She wasn't trying to create companionship. She was letting it come to her on Juniper's terms, and Juniper, little by little, kept showing up. She began following Martha slowly, room to room. Not crowding, not meowing like a house cat, just trailing, observing, chuffing softly every now and then. Her wildness wasn't gone, it had simply softened. Martha noticed how Juniper would sit by the back door and watch squirrels with intense stillness, her tail flicking once every minute. She didn't pounce, she didn't stalk. She observed. And once, when a squirrel froze and stared back at her, Juniper let out a high, curious chirrup, a sound so unexpected it made Martha laugh out loud for the first time in months. That laugh startled Juniper at first, but she didn't run. She simply turned her head as if to say, "Was that you?" It became a routine. Juniper would chuff at the coffee pot, chirrup at the broom, huff softly when Martha opened the fridge too slowly. She wasn't talking like a person, but in her own language she was filling the space, replacing silence with sound, replacing distance with rhythm. One morning, Martha sat on the back steps sipping tea wrapped in a shawl. Juniper appeared beside her, sat down, not pressed against her, but close enough that their shoulders aligned. They sat like that for 10 minutes. And then just before going back inside, Juniper reached out with one paw and tapped Martha's hand. A gesture that held no demand, only presence. That's the moment Martha understood the difference between having a pet and being chosen by something wild. And here's the lesson, one that doesn't show up in quick rescue stories or cute animal videos. Real companionship doesn't always begin with joy. Sometimes it begins with patience, with stillness, with the decision to stay even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Juniper didn't just need safety. She needed space to decide if she wanted connection, and Martha gave her that. In doing so, she opened a door far more powerful than the one attached to the crate, the door of mutual respect. Not between human and animal, but between two beings who had been through enough to understand the value of quiet belonging. Because when you've lost everything, you don't reach for noise, you reach for truth. And in that quiet moment on the rug, on the porch, beside the book, beside the window, that truth was beginning to speak. Wild animal rescue isn't just about saving creatures from danger. It's about giving them the dignity to decide what healing looks like. Not taming them, not changing them, but listening to what they ask for in the silence. Juniper had stepped across a line no one could rush, but that was only the beginning. What happened next? Her reactions to ordinary life, her unexpected outbursts, her strange sense of humor would challenge everything Martha thought she understood. Because healing, as it turns out, isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it comes with claws. For the first 2 weeks, Nothing in Martha Jean's home stayed where it belonged. Not the lampshade in the guest room, not the curtain rod in the kitchen, not the stack of neatly folded towels she'd kept on the hallway shelf for years. Juniper hadn't meant to be destructive. She wasn't acting out of rebellion. She was reacting to the creak of floorboards, to the sound of the kettle's shrill whistle, to the hum of the refrigerator at midnight that no one else noticed except her. On the third morning, Martha woke to the sound of a crash. Juniper had knocked the ceramic teapot off the counter. It wasn't deliberate, just panic. She'd startled at the microwave beep. One sudden noise, one sharp memory, and everything flew out from under her. She bolted. The teapot shattered. Martha swept it up slowly, didn't scold, just whispered, "It's all right, baby. We're all a little on edge." And they were. There's a strange rhythm in the first weeks after a rescue animal comes home, especially one like Juniper, a wildcat baby whose life had never really begun. You think the worst is over once they're safe. You think the rescue is the end of the story. But it's not. It's the beginning of another kind of chaos. The quiet, everyday kind, the kind that doesn't look dramatic but seeps into everything. Mismatched expectations, misread cues, invisible boundaries no one knows exist until they're crossed. Juniper didn't trust closed doors. She'd paw them frantically, even if someone was just in the bathroom. She didn't like overhead lights. She'd crouch low under the coffee table every time Martha flipped the switch. She refused food some days. On others, she ate as if someone might take it from her. And the TV, that was an event. Martha thought a soft documentary might help, a quiet nature program about birds. She turned it on one evening, set the volume low. Within seconds of the first bird call, Juniper yowled, loud, raw, guttural, and launched herself behind the sofa. Not out of playfulness, out of fear. Martha turned it off, sat cross-legged on the rug, waited. Juniper peeked out 30 minutes later, tail low, body tense. That was the last time Martha turned on the television for weeks. She learned instead to read aloud again. Not for herself, but for the sound of a voice that wasn't a threat. She read from gardening books, old novels, poetry. Anything with a rhythm soft enough to let Juniper settle. And slowly the sharpness dulled, but not without resistance. One night, while Martha was preparing dinner, Juniper leapt onto the kitchen table. Startled, Martha flinched just for a second, but Juniper saw it, froze, ears back, breathing shallow. In that single flicker of hesitation, something fragile cracked. She retreated to the corner of the room and didn't move for hours. That night, Martha didn't eat. She sat near Juniper, slicing an apple into thin wedges, placing them one by one in a bowl. She said nothing, just offered the quiet presence she had promised from the start. And the next morning, Juniper followed her to the garden for the first time. She didn't explore, just sat by the herbs, watched the wind, watched Martha dig gently in the soil. Her ears flicked, her breath slowed. Some things take root only after the soil has been broken open. Martha had known loss, but what she was learning now was the truth no one tells you about healing, that it isn't linear. It doesn't bloom all at once, and sometimes it looks a lot like regression. Some mornings, Juniper would curl near the fireplace and doze. Others, she'd disappear into the hall closet for hours, refusing to come out. There was no pattern, no clear signs, only patience. Raymond came by once to drop off some venison packets. As he watched Juniper slink silently through the hallway, he said, "Most people return them by now." Martha looked at him gently. "She's not a product. She's a process." He smiled. That night, Martha wrote in her journal something she hadn't done since her husband passed. She wrote about the way Juniper's eyes tracked the moon through the window, how her breathing steadied when she slept near the heater vent, how her sounds, those soft chuffs, those low hums, had started to form a pattern. A language, maybe, or at least an intention. Juniper wasn't trying to be lovable. She was trying to be real. That's what so many people miss when they watch cute animal videos online. The moments of joy are earned. They're carved out of weeks like these, the messy, unglamorous ones. When rescue means more than lifting a cage. When companionship means letting the sharp parts exist without being punished. Juniper, like so many rescue animals, wasn't dangerous. She was defensive. And in those early weeks, Martha learned to read the difference. If Juniper's tail twitched just once, it meant overstimulation. If she made a low huff before exiting a room, she was testing independence. If she pressed her head into Martha's shin, but only once, it meant I'm still here. I haven't given up. Neither had Martha. They learned together, without force, without timelines, without any need to prove anything to anyone. Because sometimes the most important bond you can build is the one no one else sees. Like the moment Juniper accidentally knocked over a potted plant and instead of running, looked up at Martha and stayed. No growl, no panic, just a pause. A question. Martha knelt, touched the broken ceramic, touched Juniper's paw. "It's just a pot," she said. "You're worth more than that." Juniper blinked. Sometimes that's all healing asks, to be told you're not your worst moment. Trauma doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it hides in shadows and corners and routines. And healing doesn't arrive with milestones, it arrives in decisions. In how you respond when things go wrong, especially when you're the only one in the room who knows how to stay. We often think of wild animal rescue as a dramatic act, but it's not. It's choosing over and over to show up for something that doesn't yet know how to trust you. It's living with unpredictability and still choosing presence. Juniper didn't become calm because she was tamed. She became calm because Martha never gave her a reason to be afraid again. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The kettle hadn't boiled yet. The sun hadn't cleared the trees. Martha Jean had just opened the back door to let the cool Appalachian air settle into the house. She was barefoot, wrapped in a faded flannel robe, watching the mist lift off the garden. Juniper sat by the kitchen table, her tail curled neatly around her paws. Her eyes followed Martha like they always did. Quiet, steady, watchful. And then just as Martha reached to clip the window open, Juniper made a sound. Not a growl, not a purr. It was soft, raspy, a short two-note chirrup like a question halfway formed. Martha turned slowly. "Was that you?" Juniper stood, walked 3 steps forward and let out another, this time longer rounder. A soft chuff like someone exhaling through laughter. Then another, and another. By the time Martha poured her tea, Juniper was talking non-stop. At first, Martha thought it was a one-off, maybe a reaction to the breeze or a leftover dream. But Juniper kept going. She followed Martha from room to room that day, offering a stream of wild cat baby noises, chirps, grunts, trills, low growls that curled into almost sentences. It wasn't just sound. It was intention. She wasn't in distress. She wasn't warning. She was commenting on everything. The toaster, the slippers, the way Martha folded the dish towel twice instead of once. Every motion earned a response, a reaction. And Martha couldn't help but laugh. She hadn't laughed in months. It wasn't just the sound Juniper made, it was the confidence behind it. As if she'd been waiting to speak all along, holding it in, testing the safety of silence before deciding it's time. Somewhere in those soft, wild sounds, Martha heard something clearer than words. "I'm not afraid anymore." Juniper didn't just talk that day. She performed. When Martha sat on the porch, Juniper leapt onto the railing and trilled at the trees. When a squirrel darted across the yard, Juniper growled, not in hunger, but in frustration, as if saying, "You again." When the wind shifted, she sniffed the air and let out a low yowl that sounded almost poetic. And that night, when Martha settled into bed, Juniper didn't curl in the corner like usual. She padded across the floor, leapt onto the blanket, circled once, and plopped down with a sigh so dramatic, so deliberate, it might as well have been a bedtime story. Martha whispered, "You've got a lot to say, don't you?" Juniper didn't answer. She didn't need to. In the days that followed, the talking didn't stop. Juniper had found her voice, and she used it. to narrate, to question, to agree, to object. Her sounds became a map of her moods. A trill for curiosity, a soft gurgle when she watched Martha knead dough, a huff when she got wet grass on her paws, and a high, short, meow-like peep when she saw birds at the feeder, always followed by a grumble as they flew off unimpressed by her presence. Martha began recognizing the rhythm. She could tell when Juniper was annoyed, when she wanted company, when she didn't, and in return, Martha began talking back. Not in full conversation, though some might argue otherwise, but in daily narration. She'd say things like, "Yes, I see the bird," or "I know I'm late with your breakfast." She'd hum softly when Juniper fell asleep. She'd offer up her own sighs, her own words, as if they were part of the same wild dialogue. And maybe they were. There's a misconception about wild animals that they're silent unless provoked, that communication is limited to fear or mating or defense. But bobcats, especially in rescue, often surprise their caretakers. They do talk, just not in the ways we expect. At Highland Pines, Raymond had seen it once before. A young male who made soft murmuring sounds whenever he was given a fresh blanket. "It's not about the blanket," he once said. "It's about association, safety, memory." Juniper's voice wasn't noise, it was memory returning. She had gone silent in that cage behind the trailer for so long, her body forgot how to speak. But now, with each passing day, she reclaimed a little more of her original self. Not the version someone tried to mold, not the cute animal for profit, the real Juniper. And that's the lesson Martha kept coming back to, especially when people asked, "Is she tame now?" She'd answer softly, "No, she's just finally herself." Juniper's constant talking became part of the rhythm of the home. It filled the background like bird song, like wind chimes. Not invasive, just present. One morning, when Martha's niece called to check in, Juniper chimed in mid-call with a series of rapid-fire chirps. The niece laughed and said, "What is that?" Martha smiled. "That's just Juniper's opinion. There's a kind of companionship that grows not through commands, but through mutual expression." Juniper didn't need to fetch or obey to be understood. She only needed to be heard. And Martha, who had spent months in silence, found herself humming again, talking to the wind, reading out loud not just for Juniper, but for herself. There was one moment about a week after Juniper found her voice that sealed it. Martha was pruning the lilac bush in the backyard. A neighbor, Gloria, had stopped by to drop off some extra canning jars. It was her first time seeing Juniper up close. At first, Gloria kept her distance. "I heard you got a bobcat, but I thought you were joking," Martha laughed. "She's very real." Juniper approached. No growling, no posturing. She sat at Martha's side and looked up at Gloria. Then, as if offering commentary on the woman's floral rain boots, she let out the longest, most theatrical chuff Martha had heard yet. Gloria froze. Martha said, "That means she approves, or disapproves." "Honestly, I'm still figuring it out." Juniper chuffed again. Gloria laughed. "She talks all day." "About what?" "Everything." Sometimes the most healing thing isn't being comforted. It's being allowed to speak. Not in words, not in perfect sentences, but in sounds that mean I belong here. Juniper's voice wasn't just communication, it was reclamation. A reminder that even in silence, the self waits patiently to return. Cute animal videos often capture the highlights, play affection laughter. But rarely do they show the moment something broken begins to mend itself from the inside out. When sound isn't a trick, but a triumph. When a bobcat talks not to entertain, but because she knows she's safe enough to be heard. That's what makes this different. Juniper didn't just start talking. She chose to, and that choice changed everything. Juniper's voice became the thread that stitched the house back together. But Martha wasn't the only one listening. The neighborhood, the community, even the curious strangers who heard about the woman with the talking bobcat, they all had opinions. Some thought it was beautiful. Some thought it was reckless. And what happened when Juniper met the world outside her new home would test everything they'd built so far. The first neighbor to say something was Mr. Halverson from 3 houses down. He'd been walking his Labrador Scout past Martha Jean's fence when he saw Juniper sitting quietly under the dogwood tree grooming her front paw like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She wasn't caged, she wasn't leashed, just present, poised, watching the wind. "She doesn't look tame," he said. "She's not," Martha replied calmly as she swept the porch. "She's just home." He gave a polite nod, tugged Scout along, and walked off a little faster than usual. That was the beginning. Woodvine was a small town with a big grapevine. Word spread faster than truth, and within a week, rumors flew Martha Jean had adopted a mountain lion. Someone said it was a lynx. Another insisted it was illegal. Someone suggested she must be lonely, or eccentric, or worse, unhinged. None of it surprised Martha. What did surprise her was how visible she suddenly felt. After years of fading into the background, after funerals, after Smokey, after months of silence, people were knocking on her door again. Not to drop off casserole, not to check in. They came to see the Bobcat. She didn't invite them in, but she didn't hide. Juniper stayed calm through it all. She didn't growl when strangers passed the fence. Didn't retreat under furniture. If anything, she grew more vocal, chuffing at the mailman, chirping at children walking to the school bus. One afternoon, she trilled so loudly at the UPS driver that he left the package halfway down the driveway and jogged back to his truck. Raymond from Highland Pines stopped by around that time just to check how things were going. He brought frozen rabbit meat and a copy of the local wildlife ordinance just in case. "Technically, you're in the clear," he said, flipping through the pages. "You're not keeping her in captivity, and this is a certified sanctuary zone." "I don't think of her as mine," Martha said. "She just lives here. Same as me." Raymond smiled. "That's what makes it work." But not everyone understood. One Sunday after church, a woman from the quilting circle pulled Martha aside and whispered, "Is it really safe, dear? I mean, what if she forgets? You're not prey?" Martha didn't answer with facts. She didn't mention the hours of behavioral observation or the vet checkups or the wildlife license framed discreetly on her kitchen wall. She simply said, "She's never raised a claw to me. Not once." There's a quiet strength in conviction, and there's another kind of strength in letting people think what they will. Juniper kept talking, Martha kept listening, and slowly, curiosity softened into respect. It was the kids who came around first. 2 brothers from the next block started walking past Martha's yard every afternoon, just to see if Juniper was out. She always was on the same patch of sun-warmed stone watching. One day, the younger boy waved. Juniper flicked her tail once. The next day, she chirped. And by the end of the week, she'd started walking along the fence line as they passed, mirroring their pace, chuffing as if offering commentary on their school bags and soccer cleats. Martha brought out iced tea for the boy's mother the following week. "She's not like a regular pet," the woman said cautiously. "No," Martha smiled. "She's better company than most." Still, there were moments of tension, like when the town council sent a quiet letter reminding residents about the handling of non-domesticated animals within residential zones. Or when a stranger left a pamphlet in Martha's mailbox titled, "Predators Among Us When Wild Animals Become Public Risk." Martha didn't respond, but she did post a sign on her fence, "Yes, she's a bobcat. No, she doesn't bite. Please speak gently. She's listening." And people did. They began stopping not to gawk, but to greet, to lean over the rail and say, "Morning, Juniper," or, "You keeping Miss Martha company today?" It wasn't just about the animal. It was about the bond. There was something undeniable in the way Juniper followed Martha's movements, answered her voice, rested her chin on Martha's knee when she sat reading in the yard. It wasn't trained behavior. It wasn't cute animal tricks. It was trust. And people felt it. One afternoon, Gloria, Martha's friend from the quilting group, came by with a pie. She hadn't visited since before Juniper arrived. "I figured you could use some company," she said. "We're doing all right," Martha replied. They sat on the porch. Juniper lingered near the edge of the steps, listening. Gloria leaned in. "Do you ever forget what she is?" Martha looked at Juniper. "No. But I think she's starting to remember who she could have been if someone had treated her right from the start." That silenced Gloria, but not in a bad way. Just long enough to hear the breeze and the birds and Juniper's low purr-like hum. One evening, a neighbor's golden retriever, Rosie, slipped her leash and wandered into Martha's yard. Juniper spotted her first. Martha braced for the worst, but Juniper didn't pounce, didn't freeze. She trotted forward, head low but not aggressive, and stopped a few feet from Rosie. The two animals stared at each other for several seconds. Then, as if understanding had passed silently between them, Juniper turned and led Rosie back toward the gate. Slow, intentional, no noise, no fuss. Martha opened the gate. Rosie slipped out. Juniper returned to her sunny spot and flopped down with a grunt, as if to say, "Well, that's handled." Word of that spread faster than the rumors had. Respect doesn't require explanation. It only needs to be witnessed, and sometimes the most powerful proof isn't what you say, it's what you live. Juniper didn't have to prove she was safe. Martha didn't have to prove she was sane. They just existed quietly, confidently together. And in doing so, they invited others to reconsider what love between human and wild animal could look like. In a world quick to judge, this was a story that didn't ask for permission. It didn't follow a template for cute animal videos or dramatic rescue arcs. It simply unfolded one shared breath at a time. Not just about animal companionship, but about how understanding can ripple out into a community. Sometimes when you stop trying to explain yourself, the world catches up on its own. Martha Jean always believed you could tell the state of a home by the way it felt at the edges, how the light moved across the floor in the early morning, how the sounds shifted with the seasons, how the silence settled in corners after someone left. For a long time, her home had felt frozen. Not cold exactly, just paused. Then Juniper arrived, and everything quietly began to move again. Not in grand, sweeping changes, but in rhythms soft, wild, and entirely her own. You couldn't chart it in a calendar, but if you watched closely, you'd see it in the seasons. Spring came late that year. The crocuses poked through the frost like they were testing the world for softness. Martha started opening windows again, just a crack at first, and Juniper would sit nearby, ears twitching, eyes half closed, as if trying to remember the smell of rain. One morning, Juniper ventured into the yard alone, just a few cautious steps past the porch, toward the patch of lilacs by the fence. Martha didn't follow. She simply stood in the doorway, mug in hand, letting the moment unfold. Juniper stopped beneath the bush, sniffed a bloom, and gave a low, approving chuff. That day, Martha began weeding the garden again. By summer, everything had loosened. The porch creaked under afternoon naps. The breeze brought in the scent of pine. Juniper took to sprawling on the flat rock by the garden beds, belly to the sun, like she owned the world. Children passed by more often now. Some would wave. Others would call out, "Hi, Juniper," like she was part of the neighborhood. She didn't answer, but she always watched. And sometimes she blinked slowly, an answer of her own. Martha began baking again. She'd leave the kitchen door open while she kneaded dough, humming to herself, and Juniper would sit just outside, trilling softly. Whenever the scent of cinnamon filled the air, it became their rhythm, their summer song. One July evening, as fireflies blinked across the yard, Martha set a chair under the maple tree and read aloud from a book she hadn't touched since her husband passed. Juniper lay nearby, stretched long and still tail flicking lazily. And when Martha finished the chapter, Juniper chuffed. It sounded like applause. Autumn brought change again. The days shortened. The hills burned gold in rust. Juniper grew more alert, more active, darting after wind-blown leaves like a kitten, then stopping, surprised at her own playfulness. Her wild cat baby instincts, once buried, began to peek through. Martha found her one afternoon perched on the back fence watching the crows. She didn't chase. She didn't pounce. She just watched, intent, curious, present. It was the kind of stillness that didn't come from fear, but from belonging. Inside the house changed too. Martha lit candles in the evenings, played soft music again. She cooked heavier meals, soups, stews, cornbread, always leaving a small dish of venison by the hearth. And Juniper. She began sitting closer, not touching, not needy, just near enough to feel the warmth. Sometimes when Martha paused her knitting, she'd feel the brush of fur against her calf. A quiet reminder. I'm here. You're not alone. Winter came with its own hush. Snow settled over Woodvine like a blanket. The porch grew quiet, the windows frosted at the edges. Martha set up a second bed near the fireplace, layered thick with quilts and an old flannel shirt she used to wear gardening. Juniper claimed it instantly. She'd curl into herself, tail-tucked head resting on crossed paws. When the wind howled, she didn't flinch. When the power flickered one stormy night, she sat alert beside Martha's chair, eyes steady as if guarding more than just the room. One morning, Martha woke to find Juniper lying at the foot of her bed, not out of habit, not seeking warmth, but simply present, as if to say, I trust you, enough to sleep near your dreams. That was the same morning Martha pulled the heavy curtains wide and watched the snow fall without ache. Time, once heavy and hard to carry, began to move gently again. The months passed not in sorrow, but in rhythm. And Martha marked the seasons not by holidays or birthdays, but by Juniper's patterns. Spring was for new sounds, new trills, new stretches, a new interest in squirrels. Summer brought shade-seeking naps and soft complaints about bees. Autumn meant pacing the fence line like a queen surveying her kingdom. Winter was for silence, shared side by firelight. There was no big moment, no dramatic change, just quiet, consistent being. Around early November, a wildlife photographer asked if he could come film Juniper for a project on rescued wildcats. Martha hesitated, but eventually agreed on one condition: no lights, no prodding. Just be still and let her be. The man arrived, respectful, quiet. He sat on the porch for nearly 2 hours before Juniper approached. She circled once, chuffed twice, then lay down at his feet, not touching, just nearby. He didn't take a single photo. When asked why, he said, "Some things are more sacred than shareable. Healing doesn't always roar back to life. Sometimes it whispers season by season as routine becomes ritual and silence becomes safe again. We often rush to measure progress, but nature doesn't. It simply shifts gradually until one day you realize you're no longer surviving. You're living." This wasn't a pet adapting to a home. It was a life, two actually learning to unfold in rhythm with nature, with time, with each other. The companionship wasn't static, it evolved. A wild animal, a grieving woman, and the passage of a year that gave them both back to themselves. It wasn't a transformation in the viral sense. It was something deeper, a reconnection with the land, with breath, with the quiet joy of simply being seen. Juniper had come full circle, from silence to sound, from pacing to resting, from observation to participation. But this story wasn't about a rescued animal anymore. It was about what she gave in return. Because when a bond forms slowly without demand, it doesn't just change the moment, it changes everything that follows. What Juniper gave Martha couldn't be explained in words, but it could be felt. There were nights Martha Jean would sit on the back porch, long after the sky had gone dark, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, the other resting lightly on the fur beside her. Juniper didn't always settle close, but when she did, it was deliberate. No performance, no need, just presence. In those quiet hours, when the garden had gone still and the only sound was the soft hush of wind moving through the pine, Martha would remember how it all began. A photo sent without words, a cage, a choice, and now a rhythm between two souls that needed nothing more than each other. Juniper hadn't just filled the silence. She'd transformed it. What started as a rescue became something far less explainable and far more sacred. Because this wasn't a story about taming a wild animal, and it wasn't about turning a cute animal video into a feel-good ending. This was about what happens when you stop trying to fix what's broken and start letting it be. It's easy to miss what Juniper taught. She didn't teach obedience. She didn't fetch or sit or stay. She didn't learn to be a pet. What she offered was quieter, but much harder to come by the kind of companionship rooted in trust, not control. She spoke when she had something to say. She left the room when she needed space. She showed up in the morning, not because someone called her, but because she wanted to. Her wildness never left. It just softened in Martha's presence. And Martha, in return, learned to do the same. One evening in late spring, a thunderstorm swept over Woodvine, the kind that shakes the windows and rattles the cabinets. Martha had just shut the screen door when she realized Juniper was still outside. She stepped onto the porch, called softly, and waited. Juniper didn't come. A minute passed, then two. Then she saw her under the maple tree body, low to the ground, eyes wide, unmoving. Martha didn't shout. She didn't coax. She simply stepped off the porch, walked through the rain, and sat cross-legged on the wet grass. She didn't touch Juniper. She didn't speak. She just sat. Within 5 minutes, Juniper moved closer, pressed her side lightly against Martha's leg. They stayed like that until the storm passed. That's the thing about rescue animals, especially wild cat babies. They don't ask for love in the ways we expect. They ask for presence, for patience, for us to get uncomfortable on their behalf. And sometimes when we do something wordless and miraculous happens. Over time, Martha stopped thinking of Juniper as rescued. Not because the past didn't matter, but because the present mattered more. Juniper had not been saved to become someone else's definition of safe. She had been given the chance to live on her own terms with someone who didn't ask her to change. And in that space, both of them grew. Martha rejoined her book club. She began writing again, short letters, journal entries, small reflections. Not about loss, but about presence, about the sound of Juniper's chuff when the first robins returned. About the way the house felt fuller without being busier, about how even the stillness had texture now. Her friends asked if she'd ever adopt another animal. She'd smile and say, "I didn't adopt Juniper. She just arrived." There's science behind what happened. Studies show that animal companionship, especially among older adults, can lower cortisol, reduce blood pressure, and ease symptoms of grief and depression. Rescue animals in particular offer a mirrored healing process. Their growth becomes a metaphor for our own. Their wild hearts teach us to live more honestly. Juniper, like so many rescued wild animals, reminded Martha of something she didn't know she'd forgotten, that healing isn't passive. It takes time, consistency, and deep listening, especially the kind done without words. Juniper didn't need to be loved into obedience. She needed to be understood into belonging. And Martha didn't need to be distracted from her grief. She needed to walk through it with someone beside her who wasn't trying to fix it. Just witness it. Stay near. Come closer when it mattered. That's the kind of animal companionship people rarely talk about. Not utility, not cuteness, but the raw, beautiful alchemy of mutual trust. Most stories about rescue animals follow a familiar path: trauma, adoption, recovery, joy. But the truth is quieter and messier. Sometimes joy comes wrapped in quiet mornings and slow routines. Sometimes the rescue isn't about survival, it's about reconnection with nature, with rhythm, with the part of yourself that still believes the world can be good. Juniper's story isn't rare because she was a bobcat. It's rare because no one asked her to become anything other than who she already was. And in return, she gave Martha everything: laughter, routine, conversation, and most of all, presence. The kind of presence that doesn't demand, that doesn't flee, the kind that just sits beside you in silence or in sound and says, "I'm here." It's early morning. The hills beyond the porch are turning pink. Martha sits with her mug wrapped in a shawl, eyes on the horizon. Juniper pads up beside her, settles in, and chuffs. Martha answers not with words, but with a slow blink. A rhythm they both understand. Now, take a breath. Think about the quiet spaces in your life, the ones that maybe feel a little too empty. Think about the connections that don't rely on noise or speed or being understood by everyone else. Maybe there's a part of you like Juniper that's just waiting for safety before speaking again. Or maybe there's someone in your world who doesn't need fixing just space to be who they are. Let this story be your reminder. The wild things in us aren't broken. They're just waiting for the right home. If this story moved something in you, if it made you feel a little softer, a little more seen, consider liking this video. Subscribe to join us for more stories that speak gently but leave something lasting. And if you know someone who needs to believe in connection again, send this their way. Let's keep telling stories that matter. Together.